We're looking at financial reporting, F7, the international stream. Clearly, the first thing I ought to do is to show you the examination paper as we begin this revision phase. Question 1 of the paper is always on consolidations. It's a 25-mark compulsory question, 5 marks of which will be written. Now, my suggestion is to read as much as you can of Steve Scott's writing, the examiner's writing. For example, in August's magazine, The Student Accountant, he's written this wonderful article about his feelings about the future with regard to the new International Financial Reporting Standard, number 3, dealing with consolidations. For example, the minority interest is now called the non-controlling interest, that kind of thing. A very interesting article indeed. When I cover my groups with you, I will mention that in more detail. So that's question 1. Question 2 is obviously on published, no writing, or at least no discussion. It's a straightforward 25-mark question. Question 3, of course, is on interpretation and cash flows. Hard to tell which one will come up in each sitting. It's best to cover both, more or less on an equal footing, though always the interpretation marks are harder to get than the cash flows. Beyond that, obviously, we have questions 4 and 5. 4, obviously, is our standards question for 15 marks. And question 5, again, another 10 marker. It's all compulsory. I've noticed that since the paper has been made compulsory, the pass rate has dropped. The first sitting, December 2007, where the paper was compulsory, it dropped from about 47% to 40%. And in June 2008, it dropped to 33%. I'm not saying it's dropping by 7% every time. All I'm saying is it's a bit of a worry on the grounds that if you do not cover the entire syllabus, you'll find it much more difficult to pass. But I think behind the scenes, one has to say that the way to analyze the paper is that there are 40 marks devoted to standards. As I indicate here, the discursive part, the discussion or discursive part, will be 10 marks for the discursive is going to be, say, 1/3 of the paper. Let's put that to one side. Another way of looking at it is something like 40 marks is on standards, partly discussion, partly numbers. That's another way of analyzing it. But if you look at the entire paper as a whole, it seems there are 3 skills you need to master: consolidations, published, cash flow and interpretation. They go together. Okay, that's 75 marks of the paper. Now, every sitting, Steve Scott, very conscientious examiner, I feel, has been the examiner for something like 26 sittings and is the longest serving examiner in ACCA's history and will continue to examine this paper. I notice every 6 months he does a very detailed feedback. His feedback is longer than any other subject usually. And I read that with great interest because it tells you how to pass, how to avoid failure. Now, what I'd like you to do is to turn, please, to the How to Pass section. That all I've done here is a little collection of past examiners' feedbacks. He's known as the listening examiner, as indeed my little story says. At a recent lecturers' conference, he says, "I'm listening." He tries very hard to listen to complaints about his paper, about the syllabus, and how difficult it is to teach, and so on, and how difficult it is for students to pass. So he has a terrific record as a very sympathetic examiner. Now, I say there in the note that you have, many markers reported in this session. So I've brought together as a compendium a collection of different examiners' comments from different sittings, but for this paper from this examiner. Many markers reported in this session that a large number of candidates were not providing workings for figures in their answers. This is a serious problem, says the examiner. If an answer is wrong, it is unlikely that any marks can be awarded. Not full marks can't be awarded. It says you get 0. any marks can be awarded, as the marker will not be able to determine how the answer was arrived at. If a numerical answer is wrong, markers can only give some merit if they are able to determine the approach taken by the candidate. This is impossible without legible workings. Now, when I discuss things with Steve Scott, the examiner, he says he and his team of markers adopt something called method marking. In other words, they go for the method that the students are using, even if the numbers are wrong. They do give some marks for the method. For that, you must show your method. So when you're doing consolidations, for example, you say investment at cost, so much. Then you say less group share of net assets at fair value at acquisition. Seems like a waste of space, a waste of time writing the method down. But if you use abbreviations, you can catch up a little bit. And then you must, once you put down your method, you then do the numbers, you see? So by using abbreviations, you can save time. And even if your numbers are wrong, you do get some marks for explaining your steps, the method. And that's what the examiner means by his second paragraph in this special note that I put together for you. The third paragraph, the layout of answers by a number of candidates was poor, with workings being squashed into corners of pages and thus being difficult to follow. To this day, I can't believe students do that, but it must be the pressure of examination, the context of the exam. Just imagine that. I'll just hold up this little sheet that I have here. What happens basically is you can't write on the extreme left-hand side, you can't write on the extreme right-hand side, the marker's right there. So what students do is they do a little answer, whatever it might be, let's say a consolidated income statement, and they suddenly realize there's a couple of steps to go, so they turn their page around and they start writing in the corner of the page. It's almost like writing a letter to a friend. That's not professional, you see. Or even if it's a written question, you can't write at the bottom of your page, turning it round, right round the edge of the page. There's nothing wrong with starting another page. Okay, so be careful of that. You mustn't squash answers into the corners of pages. Less well-prepared candidates occasionally spread an answer to a particular question throughout their script. For example, a candidate might start answering part A of question 3 on one page, then start a different question on the next page, and then later in the script, return to the rest of question 3. Just imagine that being marked. You see? You've got question 3A. On the next page, you have question 4, then maybe question 5, and then on the next page, they come back to finish question 3. So that is, such practice, the examiner says, is contrary to examination advice and makes the script difficult to mark and appraise, quite understandably. ACCA also advises candidates to start each question at the top of a new page. Remember, the paper's free, you've paid for it several times over, and you must utilize the facilities they've given you. So even as you prepare for the exam, make sure you use a proper A4 size sheet of paper so that you do not use a tiny book. The other day I saw a student using a little diary, last year's diary, to fit in a 6-column consolidated income statement. No wonder the student thought it was a difficult topic. If you start with the right sheet of paper, obviously it gives you some kind of a chance of simulating exam conditions outside the exam. So you walk into the exam and say, right, at least the paper is the same, my pen's the same, here I am with the same calculator. But if you have problems like a different size of the sheet you're writing on, it causes problems. It does. Accountancy is partly presentation. All right, be careful of that. So you must start a new question at the top of a new page, please. What else? Another exam sitting. The examiner says for that, a worrying development reported by several markers was that a small number of candidates were giving as their answers the composition of the line items without cross-casting to give the required answers. What does that mean? You're doing a consolidated statement of financial position. You say non-current assets, plant, whatever. You open brackets, you say 10,000 for the parent plus 6,000 for the subsidiary. Now, what many students do is they leave the 10 and the 6 for the marker to add across. And what the examiner says is if you fail to add across, you have not consolidated. And therefore, you haven't actually answered the question. Some lecturers, some textbooks, various people have this impression that the marker will finish your script. Can you believe that will ever happen? If you reverse roles for 1 second, can you imagine the marker saying, let's see if I can add it up, see if it balances, to see how many marks to award? It will never happen. So you have to add a cross. In fact, the examiner says cross-casting. To me, that sounds like a cross and downwards. Now, these words I have not made up myself. They've been faithfully typed up from past exam feedback and the comments. You see, why are people failing this paper? Why have people passed? And the answer is to avoid errors like that. So can I just go back to reading that with you? A number of candidates were giving as their answer the composition of the line items without cross-casting to give the required answers. Such a technique is unwelcome. Your technique to the examiner is unwelcome. That's a strong word. So no thanks, he says. And places an unfair burden on the marker and is not strictly answering the question. Because obviously, if it is consolidation, you've got to add it up. Even if you can't finish the entire question, whatever you do must be of good quality. That is how to pass. Okay, let's move on to the next point. I've used some underlining and bold print and italics. Please excuse that. The reason is I want to make this point very forcefully. Okay, people are failing this paper because of points like this. Right, here we are. There were also a number of candidates that drafted an empty pro forma answer, an outline cash flow statement or balance sheet, statement of financial position, with no figures entered in them. So there is this impression about some lecturers, some people have this impression, students do, that if you write out a blank format with no numbers, they'll somehow give you a few marks. But consider that for a moment. Isn't that a skill that is tested at F3, foundation, 1.1 as it used to be called, that sort of level? This isn't that level. This isn't F3, this is F7. So the examiner expects you to know the format. The fact that you write out a blank format means you can memorize page 76 of some handout or textbook. That's of no value to the examiner whatsoever. It's like saying I can do my 2 times tables. I can switch on my calculator. These are things that are taken for granted. You get absolutely no credit for doing them. Okay, so can I suggest put down a couple of items with proper figures in there. Let the examiner speak to you. Such an answer gains no marks. This is the writing out of an empty pro forma. If candidates are running out of time, they would be better advised to complete the calculations of only a part of a question than to give a blank answer to all of it. You see? So write out a little bit at least, but don't give a blank answer to all of it. So a very, very important point, those two, for the exam. Thousands upon thousands have failed, narrowly failed, because of those 2 paragraphs. In fact, quite consistently, the examiner and his markers seem to put together those words. And you could almost cut and paste the same comments every 6 months, even though there are different examination candidates doing it. All right, let's move on to some more common errors. Incorrect use of proportional consolidation for the subsidiary. And then you can see the examiner losing his cool here. He says, I seem to refer to this error each time I write a report. In other words, people are taking for the subsidiary 80% of plant, 80% of inventory, 80% of cash, because it's an 80% subsidiary. But don't forget, the basis of consolidation is substance over form. So in other words, if you have 80% of a subsidiary, you actually have 100% control over the entire company. Indeed, if you have 50.1%, that is the way you've got to treat it. So you've got to bring in the entire subsidiary and then take out the non-controlling interest or minority interest if you wish. Okay? So do not do proportional consolidation. I've heard privately that something like 15% of candidates do that. And that amounts to thousands upon thousands. So be careful of that. Don't fall into that category. A few calculated the minority interest, nowadays known as non-controlling interest, of course. based on the share capital and reserves. This is the basis of the minority interest in the balance sheet and completely inappropriate for the income statement or P&L. Income statement is the language you use for the international stream. Some candidates calculated a minority interest or non-controlling interest for the associate, thus showing a lack of understanding of equity accounting. You see under IAS 28. Now, what's equity accounting? This is where you leave out the associate completely from the statement of financial position, but you bring it in as a one-line item. And that one line is based on a formula, something on the lines of the group share of the net assets plus goodwill. Quite a simple method I tend to use. So that one item or that one line comes in as a single item. It isn't spread all over your statement of financial position. It has to come in as a one-line item. Be careful. That is the associate. You must not bring in 100% like we were doing on subsidiaries. Bring in the entire associate and then take out the non-controlling interests, or MI. The examiner doesn't like that. In fact, in a sense, you are the MI. You are the non-controlling interest if you have less than 50%. Remember, an associate is between 20 and 50%. What else do we have here? Candidates did not read the question. This is from yet another examination sitting. Candidates did not read the question properly and treated the ordinary shares as $1 each rather than 25 cents. This also led to errors in the dividend calculations. So clearly, if you have 150,000 of share capital in quarter dollar shares, the share capital of 150,000 represents 600,000 shares. And if he says to you, provide 3 cents per share, what you've got to do is to multiply the 3 cents by 600,000, not 150,000. So a tiny point like 25 cents rather than $1 could dramatically change that part of your answer. So be careful of that. Whenever I see these little share capital values, the par values, I tend to underline it, so I'm really clear about how to go about doing it. Indeed, if you were careless with that area, you could actually change the status of a subsidiary or an associate. And of course, the accounting is completely different. What else? Let's move on. There were a limited number of overly detailed workings and unnecessarily explanations of relatively obvious figures. Whilst this practice is not penalized, says the examiner, it does disadvantage candidates because it wastes valuable time. Now, at examiners' meetings in the past, occasionally he'll explain what he means by this. He's getting at doing consolidations using T accounts. What some people do is if they have something like a revaluation, a fair value adjustment for a subsidiary, he would a weaker candidate who's more steeped in bookkeeping will tend to do a little T account for the asset and another T account for the revaluation reserve, maybe even a journal entry. And obviously, by the time they've done all that, they haven't finished the question or got on with other adjustments. So can I say, use a lighter touch. Ask yourself, what am I doing here? Am I proving that I'm a bookkeeper, or am I just putting down a few adjustments so the market can see I understand them? And obviously, once I write them down, I can then remind myself to carry them forward into the final accounts, the statement of financial position. So that's all the workings they're trying to do. You pick up your question, you process it briefly, and then move on to finishing the question. You mustn't do lots of T accounts and too many journal entries. That is an utter waste of time. The examiner calls that overly detailed workings. What else? Another regrettably familiar feature was a number of candidates answering only 3 questions or making a negligible attempt at a 4th. Now, this comment was made when we only had to do 4 questions. All of them are 25 markers. That was in a few sittings ago when we had the old syllabus. So now I suppose he'll be complaining that people only do 4 questions rather than 5, because of course you've got to do 5 questions these days. So the 4th and the 5th are 15 and 10 marks respectively. So you must answer the required number of questions. You cannot afford to leave out even a 10 marker. What he's complaining about here is people are leaving out 25 markers. Now that is definitely not a good idea. It seemed that in some cases candidates had made this practice a deliberate strategy. That's so sad. They go into the exam saying, right, I know the question is going to be too long for me, so I'm just going to do 3 or maybe 4, currently out of 5, 4 out of 5. Not good enough, says the examiner. He can't fail you on it, but if you're a marginal candidate, he probably wouldn't bother to look at your script again if you are close to, if you don't attempt the last question. All right, so a regrettable feature, as Steve Scott says. Finally, he concludes, providing a little bit of balance. The above may appear to give an overly pessimistic view of performance. This is not the intention, nor is it the case. There were many excellent papers, hope it will be you, where it was apparent that candidates had done a great deal of studying, and these were rewarded appropriately. It is possible to get marks in the 90s on this paper. A student of mine recently got 91. He was pipped to the finishing line by someone who got 93 on this paper. I'm talking about December 07. I haven't heard about the most recent marks. The full analysis hasn't come out yet. But that's the kind of mark you can get, 80s, 90s, quite easily. Remember how to approach this paper. Obviously, try to simulate exam conditions as you prepare for the exam using proper size paper, etc. What else can I say? Have plenty of structure. When you're doing groups, just follow my little method. When you're doing published accounts, follow my ORAL method. When you're doing cash flows, you can use ORAL again. And then when you're doing the written questions, use bullets. Okay? And that will ensure that your script is easy to mark, and it shows that you put some thought into it. But above all else, do plenty of workings for the numerical questions. Markers love that.